questions before we begin? All right, so we talked about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. Positive and negative reinforcement, right? We're talking about operant conditioning. So here, just to keep it simple, we say positive reinforcement is something where you add a stimulus, right? We said examples is when you pet a dog, comes when you call it, or pay someone for work done. Negative reinforcement, removing the burst of stimulus, right? So positive is adding something to reinforce the behavior. Negative is removing something to reinforce the behavior. And I'm going to show a quick video that deals with delayed reinforcement. In a second here. All right, so immediate and delayed reinforcers, right? Immediate, you can teach someone or something, right? An animal or any sort of animal or human being for that matter. You can teach them different ways, right? Based on their schedule. You can teach them in a quicker way by, we would say, immediate reinforcement. Immediate reinforcement will be, hey, we're trying to train rats or pigeons to do something. So in order to reinforce that behavior, because the rat or pigeon may forget it very quickly, we're gonna keep giving them some food. You're able to do this task, you immediately get gratification or positive reinforcement from some sort of food, right? That would be the motivation or the stimulus. Now the same would go for human beings, right? We could say, hey, we could provide something that's very, very continuous, which kind of deals with substance abuse or addiction. If you think of someone who gets hooked on a highly addictive drug like cocaine, heroin, crystal meth, they will seek out that gratification constantly, right? Maybe several times a day, for that matter, right? Not just once a week, twice a week, right? On the other hand, you say, well, maybe there's some drugs that's not as addictive, say marijuana. Maybe I smoke weed twice a week or something, right? Or I smoke weed 4 times a month, right? To get that gratification, that stimulus. And then you have, so you can have one a delayed schedule or immediate. Now delayed or intermittent, as we'll talk about, right? Partial, intermittent, kind of deals with, think of gambling, right? So you go into the casino, you go to the blackjack table, you go to the craps table, or you go to the slots, right? So you play the slots, and you keep playing, and you win, right? That dopamine kick shoots to your brain. Oh my gosh, I won $50. This is awesome. I bet if I keep playing, I might win even more, right? So casino, very smart people understand this at the casino. They say, oh wow, this is positive reinforcement, but it's variable, it's intermittent. It happens randomly. No one knows exactly when it's gonna happen. But like we say, that dopamine kick kind of happens on the journey to winning, right? It's like the dopamine kick is higher while you're traveling to get to the destination and planning it and thinking about it. Thinking about all the things you're gonna do when you get there. And it comes down a little bit lower when you actually get there, right? So once the gambler plays and wins, now the dopamine kick kicks up very high and thinking of, I could win again. I absolutely could win again. I just don't know when, right? Or I could figure this out. Or I've cracked the code to gambling. I know how to win each and every time. They keep playing, eventually they lose all their money. It never comes because they have a finite set of money, right? A limited amount of money. And so it never happens. So they come back, right? They come back to be reinforced and say, wow, I remember what it's like to win. That was phenomenal. And I want to come back and feel that same experience, right? So now they're put on a intermittent schedule, right? Reinforcing the response only part of the time, results in slower acquisition of a response, but much greater resistance to extinction that does continuous reinforcement. So he said, well, not everyone is gonna get hooked at gambling. Some people are like, oh, okay, yeah, I lost some money, I'm never coming back here. I'm not doing that again. While others depend on several other factors. Would say, no, I need that, right? I've acquired that reinforcement. Some people say, I don't acquire that because it takes me a lot more time to hook me. One person may say it takes me a shorter time to hook me, especially with gambling. Right, so we say partial reinforcement versus continuous reinforcement, immediate reinforcement. They're all different and they all help in different ways to help reinforce a behavior to get one to be conditioned to do something, to learn, right? Because we're talking about how we learn. Now, how would this stuff apply for school, right? You're here at Concordia, obviously you're motivated, you're stimulated to come here. What is some of the reinforcements here, to be here? Like, what are some of the reinforcement that Concordia is using, or college in general, or society at large, using to reinforce your behavior? Keep showing up to college. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, the satisfaction of being like your grades up and stuff, like, at least for me, it feels good when I'm like passing on my classes and I don't have to worry about it. So like, that's something for me.
Yeah, so we say grades, right? We say, hey, the letter A, the letter B, whatever. Right? It reinforces and motivates you when it finally happens. You're greatly satisfied, and thus you do the cycle all over again, right? If I go to the courses, maybe the reinforcement schedule is variable, right? Say you first show up to class the first couple of days, like kind of exciting, right? And then towards the middle, it kind of slows down. Then towards the end, when you know it's gonna end, like you're like, oh, okay, this is gonna end soon, and hopefully I get a great grade. Kicks up really high, right? To be highly reinforced, and you can see that, right? You can see people who, show up early, at the beginning stages of the semester, then it kind of dies down, right? And towards the end, because obviously it'll be springtime, everybody's out. And everybody's up early and no one's as tired as they are, right? Because the sun is out, we're on these cycles, it will just feel different. Let me pull up a video. I want to show Skinner's laboratory here. All right, so we say B.F. Skinner's, one of the primary behaviorists, right? But really big for operant conditioning, right? The kind of conditioning we're talking about to train and learn. And here's his laboratory dealing with some birds. I think maybe a dove.
Each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a colored disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behaviour of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what they call reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. Usually use a response with the pigeon pecking a little disc, a spot in the wall, and you can reinforce with food. But you don't reinforce every time, perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. There is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules is very effective with rat for pigeons. It's what we call the variable ratio schedule. That is at the heart of all gambling devices and has the same effect. A pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case in the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because it feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows, and this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes, well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on, have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, you find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act of will, and eventually, I think, we need to attribute nothing to it.
Okay, thoughts. Basically, Skinner said nobody has free will. Free will is imagined, right? It's a result of us believing that we have free will, when really we're just all operating on some sort of conditioning, right? We're acting upon some stimulus that we've been trained and conditioned to learn. Agree or disagree with Skinner?
Agreed.
You agree, no free will. Human beings have absolutely no free will.
Well, you know what? Partially, because I feel like everybody's free will can be manipulated. Like at the casinos, people will be like, "Oh, why do you go to the casino so much? Why do you spend so much money?" And then they say, "Because I want to." But like the circumstances that they're under makes them want to spend that money. So you know what I mean? It's just the way that people think about it.
So partial free will. Anybody else agree or disagree with Skinner? No free will? Absolute free will? Alright, but as you can see, they kind of related the gambling to the pigeons, right? Because they're playing the background sounds of the pigeons while the people were gambling. So basically make the human beings look just like they were in a laboratory. Yeah, basically, a casino is a laboratory, right? And it's using the same sort of techniques that Skinner was using with the pigeon, a variable rate of reinforcement, right? give some sort of reward at certain point in times, and you stop it over X amount of times, and reintroduce it at another time. Okay? When you think of how powerful it is, you can actually create addictions, right? And so we could create addictions for food, we could create addictions for maybe any forms of social success we might observe out in the world. And very powerful stuff on how it instructs our behavior. So Skinner was talking about more of a variable ratio schedule, right? Unpredictable number of responses. And then fixed interval schedule, specified time, right? That one will have like an actual mathematical process to it. All right, so here's just an intermittent reinforcement schedule representation, y-axis, number of responses, x-axis, the time it takes in minutes to respond, and this is showing the difference in how they respond for the pigeons, right? So we can see variable ratio, a lot of responses over a short period of time, whereas steady responding has not as many responses over a longer period of time. Now punishment. Punishment is something a little bit different because punishment is sort of introducing something in a negative way, right? Like adding something in a negative way. Here, for example, they give kind of spanking, right? So something, what does that say? Administers an undesirable consequence or withdraws something desirable in an attempt to decrease the frequency of a behavior. Right here they say child's disobedience. One could see introducing spanking, right? Presenting a negative consequence after undesired behavior is exhibited, making that behavior less likely to happen in the future. Or negative punishment, removing a desired stimulus after a particular undesired behavior exhibited, resulting in reducing that behavior. What are some examples you could give of some punishment that alters behavior out in society? Yeah, right, so receiving a speeding ticket, you're receiving a ticket, you have to pay a fine, right? They introduce something to you to hopefully stop you from speeding, right? Anything else you can think? So there's some major drawbacks of physical punishment, right? The punished behavior is suppressed but not forgotten. The temporary state may negatively reinforce parents' punishing behavior. So it doesn't work for everyone, right? There's a lot of arguments about punishment and how to go about it. Sometimes it's not forgotten, right? And so it may actually harm people later on in life. Punishment teaches discrimination among situations, perhaps only selectively decreasing the undesired behavior. So we could say that conditioning, you know, if it's done by your parents or maybe a romantic partner, they're trying to be selective in the situation, right? They're trying to force this situation for you to have a perspective about the situation, which may not be the right way of going about that. Right, and punishment can teach fear. So if you're punished, you're gonna be fearful of it, and you may really not learn about why you are fearful of that thing, or why that thing is bad, or good, for that matter. And physical punishment may increase aggression by modeling violence as a way to cope with problems, which we'll talk about here in the next section, which is observational learning, right? A lot of us learn through observation. We watch other people and we try to imitate and emulate their behavior for various hosts of reasons. So here we're giving some applications of operant conditioning, right? In sports, behavioral methods are used to shape behavior and athletic performance, right? Making an athlete practice the same number of free throws, you know, a ridiculous amount of free throws to try to get them to be better at doing such, right? We may reward them in some way. Or at work, rewards have been successfully used to increase productivity and skill development. Right, so if your boss says, I'm gonna give you a commission, or you're gonna get a bonus if you meet this quota, or these sales numbers, thus you start working harder because now you've been introduced with something that you feel will be beneficial to you. And at home, basic rules of shaping are used in parenting and to reinforce our own desired behaviors. Right, so with children, basically, they're taking on the conditioning of the parents and how the parents think the child should be, what they should learn, what they should value, et cetera, et cetera. So extinguishing desired behaviors, right? Decide how, when, and where you will work towards your goal. Monitor how often you engage in your desired behavior, and reinforce this desired behavior and reduce the rewards gradually. And that's how you sort of extinguish even addictions, right? You start to, no one goes cold turkey because cold turkey has adverse effects on the body, and thus you need to gradually start removing those rewards you receive from any sort of addiction. Let's get to observation. I had to fix these slides. Observational learning. Higher animals, especially humans, learn without direct experience by watching and imitating others. Right, Alvin Bandura was a psychologist in the 60s, pioneered the research of observational learning, and he had an experiment called the Bobo doll experiment, which is basically this big doll filled with sand that can bounce back up and you punch it. You've probably seen it before. And he used it with experiments with children. Right, so we'll have the children maybe watch adults punch the Bobo doll, or watch the children will watch other children punch the Bobo doll to see if they would imitate that behavior. Right, and it's called modeling, the process of observing and imitating a specific behavior. Let's see, I got a YouTube video of Bobo doll. Let's watch that.
Segment you're about to see is an early experiment on learning aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. The children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a created doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly as high. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained varied flame materials.
Okay. So you get Okay, so we imitate, right? Observational learning, we tend to imitate others. And we do this because we have something in our brain called mirror neurons, right? Mirror neurons are there to introduce an observation and be able to react in the same exact way as that observation, which essentially is placing yourself in the experience of what you're looking at. Right, so if you see a guy driving a Lamborghini on Instagram and you start to imagine yourself wanting to do the exact same thing, or any other particular car, particular type of clothes, a particular action that that person's doing, or maybe for females watching tutorials on makeup, trying to get that exact look, exactly the way it is, et cetera, et cetera. Any idea, any questions about the Bobo dog, or any commentary on that, the Bobo dog experiment? Do you see this often, like with children?
When they see other children, when they see other children do the same thing.
Do you see them doing it, repeating the same language as the adults as well too? Or maybe some of the violence? Right, so you can see this besides if it's children, you can see it in adults, right? You go and you see everyone sort of behaving the same in a particular environment, particular neighborhood, particular community. People tend to speak the same, people tend to dress the same, people tend to exhibit the same actions, right? They imitate one another. One of the things for observational learning, say of like with monkeys, right? So with, like monkeys, you can introduce a source of gestures and get the monkeys to repeat the exact same gestures. You can see that at the zoos. Eventually start to repeat. The people who come to the zoo, whatever gestures they start introducing, whether it be vulgar ones or what have you. But it doesn't apply to everyone. Not everyone imitates because we all have different number of mirror neurons in our brain. So it really is situational and in context of the individual. All right, so that's pretty much it for classical and operant conditioning, right? So basic idea, learning, classical conditioning, learning associations, right? Between events we do not control. Response is involuntary or automatic. We acquire through associating those events with neural stimulus, with other conditional stimulus, and extinction, we decrease we decrease that with conditional stimulus is repeatedly presented alone, spontaneous recovery, generalization, discrimination. Then operant conditioning is learning associations between our behavior and its consequences, and it's voluntary and operates on the environment. So we'll end off with learning here. Any questions about this stuff? Does it make sense? All right. Let's get into chapter 8. All right, chapter 8 deals with memory. All right, so memory is a pretty complicated thing. We have short-term and long-term memory. We have ways that we retrieve memory. We have methods of storing memory. So in essence, you could kind of compare memory to memory on a computer, right? So you can say you buy a computer that has a large amount of memory on it. That means you can open up more tabs on your browser. You're able to retrieve things pretty quickly. And then you have your hard drive. So your hard drive would be your long-term memory, right? Whereas your memory on the computer would be sort of your short-term memory. Long-term would be things that you kind of have to dive deep for, right? You gotta go searching through some files in order to retrieve that memory. So we get things like encoding memories, right? How do we encode? Then we got forgetting, memory construction, and ways to improve memory. All right, so here they're defined memory as persistence of learning over time through the encoding, storage, and retrieval of information. All right, there's some evidence of this, so we can recall information. All right. We do recognize what we've recalled, and we would learn it more easily on the later attempt. Which means that we have some sort of prior information in our memory about something, we can learn it a lot easier with it, rather than it was novel to us, if it was something new, newly introduced within our storage. So there's 3 measures of memory retention, right? First one is recall, a measure of memory in which the person must retrieve information learned earlier, as on a fill-in-the-blank test, all right? So the blank means that you've been asked a question about something that you've learned previously, right? So you have to recall the information. Recognition, a measure of memory in which the person identifies the items previously learned, as on the multiple choice test, right? You actually see it on the piece of paper. One of them may be the answer. How do you know which one's the correct answer? You've memorized it from previously seeing it, right? So that's recognition. And then relearning is a measure of memory that assesses the amount of time saved when learning material again. So relearning sort of reinforces a quicker time, right, to recall something. So Dr. Ebbinghaus found that the more times he practiced a list of nonsense syllable on day 1, the less time he required to relearn it on day 2. The speed of relearning is one measured by memory retention. So here, we're given on the x-axis number of repetitions of a list on day one, time and minutes taken to relearn the list on day two. Alright, so as rehearsal increases, relearning time decreases. So you can think of maybe if you're an actor and you're reading your script, you're trying to prepare yourself for either a play or a movie or something, repetition, right? Repeating it over and over and over again. Helps you, stores in your memory and makes it more accurate over time. Tests of recognition and of time spent with learning demonstrates that we remember more than we can recall. So we build models in our heads using memory, right? So we use memory models to think, communicate about memory. One of them is the information processing model, which compares human memory to computer operations. Like I just said, like a computer is relative to short-term storage and hard drive storage. Right, so it involves three processes: encoding, storing, and then retrieval. And then we got connectionism information processing model, which focuses on multi-track parallel processing, the processing of many aspects of a problem simultaneously, which means that we could be learning, multiple things at once, and they're both being stored in their respective areas of memory. This views memories as products of interconnected neural networks. So if we're learning multiple things at once and we're storing those things, sometimes they can get twisted up together or overlap. And therefore we might associate some old memories with something else, right? That may have crossed paths. Which shows that sometimes if we recall something, we may add in some things that actually did not happen with that thing. So here are the three processing stages in the classic Atkinson-Shiffrin model. This is a pretty big model from the 60s. We record to be remembered information as fleeting sensory memory, the immediate, very brief recording of sensory information. We then process information into short-term memory, which we call activated memory, that holds a few items briefly before we encode it through rehearsal. And finally, information moves into a long-term memory, a relatively permanent and limitless storehouse of the memory system of knowledge, skills, and experience for later retrieval. Which means our memory can be limitless, right? But as we look into intelligence, we see that a lot of times people do great academically because they have sort of what we call an eidectic memory, right? People who can read books and recall a lot of stuff from it versus people who need to read it several times in order to recall certain things from it, right? Which is different than intelligence because that's just pure memory. So, people who could do well on certain exams that they take, say it was just multiple choice or fill in the blank. If you have outstanding memory, you ace everything. But then maybe if you ask them to write something out in paragraph form, right, about an explanation or something, they may do poorly on that thing, right? Because that's a whole different way of thinking. There is, cases of people who have, high extreme versions of certain aspects of autism who can recall things very vividly, like looking at, Sistine Chapel for maybe 2 minutes. And then you ask them to draw it, and they have the artistic skill, they could probably draw every single detail, even though they only saw it for 2 minutes. Whereas us, that would be nearly impossible. So here they're given an illustration of sensory memory, working short-term memory, and long-term memory storage. Right, we take things from external events, they're inputted into our sensory memory. So we can say we have muscle memory, right? We got things that in our muscle, we have organ memory, things in our organs that we memorize. And then it's going from automatic processing here and jumps clearly to long-term memory storage, right? But this way is a little bit of the more, I would say, this route is broken up, right? So we said we encode at this stage, which is attention to important or novel information. We said, okay, well, here's some stuff that's actually really new, we need to pay attention to this stuff. And then it goes into our working short-term memory. We're gonna need this information soon, right? Sooner than later. In which case, we will rehearse the information and have some sort of active maintenance on it. And then we go to encode it into long-term memory storage if we find it to be necessary to go there, so that we can retrieve it here and bring it back out. Right? So basically in our brains, we sort of decipher what's important to be needed immediately or in the short term, and what's not important that we could come back to later on, at a later time. And lastly, working memory, right? This stresses the active processing occurring in the second memory stage. It's a newer understanding of short-term memory that adds conscious active processing of incoming auditory and visual spatial information and of information retrieved from long-term memory. Right, this focused processing handled by central executive. What that just means, what all that means is this is conscious memory, something we're gonna be highly aware of, because we're gonna find that's gonna be useful in a situation very soon. I'll end off here, and we'll come back to this on Wednesday. Any questions?